Hello, and welcome to Stories Across Borders. Here we discuss stories told across a range of different media, books, movies, games, you name it. The only rule is that we can only discuss things in terms of the writing. Anything like acting, animation, mechanics, etc. is out, unless it relates directly to how the story is being told. I'm Daniel Radford the Ginger, author somewhere between the guy with a beard and literal angel, and also your host. And today I'm joined by my usual co-host and member of my fellowship, John Kernan, as we continue our cycle on fantasy stories.
Hey, you can just call me Strider, because I live in the woods now.
Well played. Well, that was an intro.
That
Moving
was an
on.
intro.
Obviously enough, this time we're focusing on Lord of the Rings because it's a cycle on fantasy. How the hell could we not do an episode on Lord of the Rings?
What do you want for us to talk about fantasy as a greater whole and not the thing that almost subsumed the genre into itself?
Yeah, that just wasn't gonna happen. We would probably be hunted down with like pitchforks and torches if we didn't do it. So let's dive in.
Yeah, if we didn't want to talk about Lord of the Rings, the only one who would be on our side is Tolkien. He'd be rolling over in his grave, being like, "No, everybody, it's fine, it's fine. It's been talked about enough. Leave him alone."
Speaking of talking about Tolkien. Now, look, audience, I know that I have been critical of Tolkien's writing in the past, and with a measure of frequency even on this show. I am aware of this. I promise you that's not what this is going to be. I would I I would never discredit that man as a writer and as a talent. I do genuinely love these stories and the characters they contained, and I am astonished by the world that Tolkien crafted. Genuinely. I just find his prose extremely dry. So, yes, I prefer the movies for my own consumption, and they're my primary point of reference because I have not exactly gone back to the books since I dabbled in them. I'm aware
And
that
you know
is.
what? That's okay.
Yeah, I know that that's a cardinal sin for an author, especially one who has written and will write more fantasy in the future. But trust me, I do genuinely respect the man and like his stories, okay? We good?
Honestly, there's only one really noticeable thing you're missing in the movies that I've always been mad isn't in the movies, and that's Tom Bombadil. I love Tom
One of
Bombadil.
the easiest things to omit.
I guess so. I just think he's such an important part of how Lord of the Rings is constantly reminding you that despite how grand this narrative is, we're only seeing such a small part of this world and its history. I think he's the greatest portent of just like, oh, I'm sorry. There's this guy who lives in the woods that seems to be married to what is essentially a forest goddess or something similar. And he can flick the one ring around and shrink it and grow it in its hand and just look at it like it's a stupid bauble he wants nothing to do with. Excuse me?
And then just move on and never address that ever again.
Yeah, excuse me, this man who's apparently powerful enough that he doesn't just have poems written about him. He makes poems as he goes and kind of exists in poems, and also Gandalf was genuinely seriously considering asking him to hold on to the ring so it would be safe there, but he himself is like, yeah, I don't know. I could probably hold on to it a while, but not forever, and that wouldn't solve the problem. I don't know. They'd get me eventually. No.
Yeah, I mean, that's something. But it goes to it, both that and the dryness of Tolkien's work together actually speak towards what is inarguably the strongest element of it all. And that is the world building because that's the reason it's so dry is that he created this massive world that couldn't possibly be contained within the confines of the story he was telling, and was like, I want to show you as much of it as I can. And even then, still couldn't fit it all in the books.
No, there's so much in the annotations and the what's it called? I always forget because it's named after an organ and people don't put them in books very often anymore. The appendix?
Appendix, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, not only was there annotations and appendices and indexes galore, but there had to be an entire fake history book effectively made about the world of the story because of Middle Earth and beyond, because it wouldn't fit in the context of just The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. It's funny. I always kind of got the vibe that Tolkien never intended on even like the literal stories he just wrote being as big as they are. But Tolkien is a philosopher, which means whatever else he is, he's also a big thinker. And it is impossible for someone like him to come up with so much ideas for the world and so much of these things without constantly wanting to show them off and for people to see. And it's one of the things I love about reading the books. But the fact of the matter is, it is meandering. And there's nothing wrong with that. He likes to meander. Honestly, I feel like one of the big things he thinks and expresses in Lord of the Rings is that everybody should meander a little more, while the road less traveled, wander around, explore, look at things, be have your imagination and all that. You never know what might be just off the beaten trail, but that doesn't mean that's not something that like throws people off or can sometimes be annoying. Like I would get why anybody would find it annoying or too slow.
It's not even the too slow that gets me. It's genuinely it it feels like reading a history book a lot of the time. Like, and that's partially by design because it is a fictional retelling of the events of the story as written by Frodo. So
Yeah, it is in fact a book.
it is it even the story that has a fake history book written about it is effectively a fake autobiography. So I I get why it feels the way it does, and I don't think it's inherently a flaw in the prose necessarily. It's just something that I personally don't vibe with. I don't want the fiction I read to read like non-fiction and be incredibly dry because that makes it less compelling for me personally. But again, it speaks to the vastness of everything that this man built. Middle Earth is a sprawling setting that is only a chunk, effectively, because there's like, what is it called? The like elves other place they have, and then there's a bunch of other like extra planes beyond and things like that.
I
Or
always forget, but
it's
it's
a very Yggdrasil kind of vibe where,
yeah, I was gonna say it reminds me a lot of the way the worlds in Nordic mythology are laid out.
which makes sense because he did draw a lot on Nordic mythology for the basis of like of his story and his world.
Mm.
And just in that just in that we've got elves, dwarves, Maya, Belrogs, wizards, and hobbits, and orcs, and other orcs, and goblins, and ents, and basically hobbits, but not really, and whatever the fuck Tom Bombadil is, and
Yeah. Speaking of which, one of the things I always find funny in Lord of the Rings is so many fantasy worlds. One of the things that gets aped the most is, the various races and societies either being extinct or so greatly diminished from where they were. And the thing I think weirdly gets imitated the least is that people forget sometimes in Lord of the Rings, humans are just as diminished as everyone else. They are just literally a younger race. So they're still kind of inheriting the earth from the likes of the elves and such, but like humans have also been a long time and descended from basically just better humans. We're more or less told, yeah, humans used to be amazing and have this like idyllic society in a lot of ways. And when all the bad stuff happened, it actually went the way of Atlantis. And what we're seeing is the dregs scraping their way back up from the fall.
Yeah, because that's the thing. Like all of these different races all have expansive histories behind them that got them to this point. And inside those histories and those races or species, I guess, also have multiple different cultures and subcultures that are all very deeply fleshed out on top of those histories and things. It's like the scale of what Tolkien did cannot be understated. The man, I mean, he was a linguist professionally, so it's not that surprising. The next part, we all know it. Half of this was just a vehicle for conlangs, but the man created multiple functional languages with their own rules and conventions just for this world.
Yeah, he did such a good job. You can't stop nerds from doing everything they can to learn it.
So, regardless of what you think of the story or the prose or any of it, even if you for some reason don't like anything about Lord of the Rings, you still have to be impressed because of the I don't think anyone has done what he has done.
No, especially because he did it so thoroughly, fully, and beyond anybody who came before him that even people trying to do the same thing almost comes off as trying to imitate him.
Like people, there are plenty of other fantasy writers who have these big sprawling worlds with long histories and things like that, many of whom were inspired by Tolkien. But the depth to which everything goes is unparalleled. Like the closest I can think of is probably George R. R. Martin, who is deeply inspired by Tolkien. He to the point where he even tries to write like him, you know? And even A Song of Ice and Fire's world, I think, doesn't come close.
No, it doesn't. It's truly wild. I feel like the world of Lord of the Rings is so thoroughly realized that if any of the quantum mechanics stuff about the human collective unconscious and it creating things is true, then Middle Earth definitely just exists somewhere. Like, there's no way it wouldn't exist if thinking about things enough can make them exist.
It's like keeping that in mind. It's easy to see how Lord of the Rings and by extension The Hobbit, or I guess The Hobbit came first technically,
As long as we're talking about the Hobbit book and not the movies.
obviously. It's very easy to see how they became the bedrock of modern fantasy. And like we said, we touched on this in our first episode of the cycle. Tolkien wasn't the first modern fantasy author, technically speaking. There were people who came a little bit before him who did their own thing, and there were people who were contemporaries writing around the same time. But by and large, he's the originator of what we understand as modern fantasy. And it's so easy to see how that happened by looking at the scale because everything is there. The adventure, the drama, the intrigue, but also the complex world building full of these fantastical races and cultures and magic and histories. All of this that we have come to think of as emblematic of fantasy world building started with Tolkien in a lot of ways. I mean, if we're being honest, most of it started with mythology, but as we think of it, started with Tolkien.
Yeah, I mean he one of the things he said is that he also wanted to create a mythology for England because it's
Which is weird
funny enough.
because England has its own mythology.
Yeah, but not in the same way that there's the Greek and Roman pantheons and
Oh,
the
I mean, no, they had those too. It's just that, centuries of various invasions and crusades and Christianization have thoroughly eradicated those things.
well, and they were also like very fluidly, since England was much more presently present, than those other cultures on the grand global stage. That also meant that England's mythology was just very fluid and muddy and prone to being tossed around as history happened. So he was creating something that like would just would exist and people could get into and enjoy and do whatever they wanted with, but wouldn't be so subject to the whims of reality happening, I suppose.
I suppose. And I mean, it's definitely had. I don't know if he succeeded in creating a mythology for England, but he definitely created plenty of mythology for his world. And again, it just can't be. I can't, as a person who does plenty of world building, who has spent years world building some things that will never be used professionally, but took plenty of effort. I can't even fathom what he did, the extent of it. So it it being the foundation, the bedrock for all these things that it spawned, that spun off of it, that grew out of it, makes sense. And it can't be stressed enough that like the fantasy genre as we know it would not exist without his work.
No, whatever it would be, it would look like something completely different and unrecognizable in comparison to what we have.
And I'm not even just talking books either. All of it. No D&D, no Final Fantasy, no Song of Ice and Fire, none of the things inspired by them or spun off of those. None of it would exist or exist the way it does without this because he created something that was so engrossing and compelling and detailed that it could be the bedrock that an entire modern version of this genre just about grew out of. And let's be, again, we touched upon this already, so I don't want to get too much into it because we already talked about a lot in the first episode. But, you know, there's good and bad in that because the downside is that we now get a lot of stuff that is desperately trying to be the next Lord of the Rings.
Yeah,
Everything now is elves, dwarves, dragons, wizards.
and they're almost always the version that exists, or at least a twist off the version that existed in Lord of the Rings, which for many of those creatures, especially like elves and dwarves, are very different from what their original like folktale incarnations were.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, I think a really good example of that actually, right, is that in the world of like D&D and its assorted like settings, elves are very strongly associated with the Fae, and that is almost entirely because Tolkien's elves are these graceful, mysterious, ancient, nature-attuned beings, but the elves or elvish or elf equivalents of like Nordic mythology and Slavic mythology that would have inspired so much of his writing, weren't really that.
No.
In the same way that you know, their dwarves were different, etc., etc. So it's almost missing the point to not be inspired to be inspired by his work and just water down what he did rather than try and build something new. Granted, it's hard to build a fantasy race or races or cultures that are not inspired or similar to something that exists in his work because it's so extensive, or reality because it's reality. But it is sort of like the double-edged sword of creating something so vast and foundational is that inevitably generations down the line, you've now still got people who are going, well, I mean, elves just have to be this.
Yeah, and it's an unfortunate thing that's in an inevitability because something like Lord of the Rings doesn't happen without doing that. Not just in the way that like it's inevitable that something with that much reach will have that effect on the genre, but also without doing those kinds of adaptations and changes that ended up being so defined, something like Lord of the Rings couldn't even be created in the first place because it's too big, it's too sprawling, and people need context to understand things. And if you try to create something as big as Lord of the Rings and everything in it is a completely new thing with a completely new word and idea that people have never seen before, I guarantee you it would never like spread so far or be as understood or accepted as Lord of the Rings was. People can only handle so much new per square inch as they are reading.
Yeah, and we are bombarded with content nowadays. But see, what are the interesting things for me though, right? Looking at this almost like as a again writing genealogy, right?
I thought you were about to say writing genius, and I was going to be like, yes, yes, of course.
I mean that too. No, is that despite Lord of the Rings, right, being in so many ways the archetypical fantasy story, despite it being a version of the hero's journey, even, it still differs in some pretty fundamental ways from a lot of the fantasy that has derived from it. And some of that comes from that watering down process, and some of it comes because people are wanting to tell different stories and things like that. But when you think of like the typical fantasy hero journey, right? What we usually end up with is our naive protagonist, much like Frodo, goes out on their journey, they learn more, they grow more. But a key difference that I think is very interesting to me is that whilst in a lot of fantasy stories, the process of that journey is it's not just about knowledge, a lot of it comes down to becoming more powerful and skilled as well. And that is something that's largely absent from The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, Frodo does not become more powerful. If anything, he's not fully himself anymore. He's diminished when he comes back.
Yeah, it's very interesting. He is weak at the start and he's weak at the end, like physically. He is he's learned a lot more, yeah, about the world, but what he's experienced has also been soul crushing.
Yeah, like his soul has literally been worn away in places along the journey.
And he's not the only character who doesn't really grow in ability. None of the hobbits really grow overly much in abilities. They get more proficient, yes, but it's not like your standard hero's journey where you start out as a farm boy and end up as a god amongst men. You know, they're still small, weak, and comparatively untrained and unpracticed compared to the likes of Aragorn or Boromir or Gandalf.
And even the rest of them, like the only one who's the only two you could kind of say are more powerful than before are Gandalf and Aragorn. But Gandalf, that's because he went through his own whole weird angelic rebirth thing, and Aragorn has a newer, better sword and is big kingly man now. But for the most part, like the only way I could really say all of them have consistently grown stronger is they've all gotten better at teamwork. They're the way that they got stronger is their fellowship, even though the fellowship itself was broken at the end of our first act of the story, ultimately.
Yeah, and I'm not saying for the record that the modern idea of go on journey, become powerful is bad. I think I personally enjoy a lot of stories that do that. I just
Yeah.
think it's interesting that that's where we started and this is where we've gotten because I guess a lot of it will come into themes, which we're definitely going to have to talk about because there's a lot of that in Lord of the Rings. But it's interesting, and it's not the only way it differs as well, right? It's quite common, I think, now to have a lot of small story threads all converge in one place. Like, I mean, obviously, Lord of the Rings does that too. But what I'm saying is, it's not that unusual for like the group to start apart in separate chapters and then come together as the like party. I feel
Yeah,
like I've seen that a decent amount.
and he committed to the breaking of the fellowship. The fellowship does not reform.
That's exactly it. And then you have your party, and they very rarely will go off and do their own thing. And you know, there's plenty of stories where they still do, but it's not the default understanding of fantasy. Whereas, yeah, in Lord of the Rings, the party comes together, the fellowship comes together. And I don't think any of them see each other again necessarily. Like, obviously, the hobbits still see each other, and the other groups see each other and things like that. But I feel like the different subgroups they don't really see much of each other, if anything else of each other, for the rest of the story and beyond, which is interesting.
Yeah, at the very least, not until like it's over, because they were all they were all friends. I'm sure they all met up at least once or twice for drinks and stuff.
I think they all attended like Aragorn's coronation or something. They did in the movie.
Yeah, and I'm sure there was time in between where they came to visit too. But like as far as the story is happening for the purposes of the story, it's like no, they can't. They're on their own journeys. They all have their own things to do. And if every single one of them doesn't individually succeed at what they're going off and doing, it would all fall apart.
Oh, every single one of them, their journeys after the Fellowship splits could have been their own book.
Yeah. I mean, hell, the two towers, like that that has so much emphasis on Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli that like they are the bulk of the important moments of that story to the point where when they tried to make a video game of it, the Two Towers video game is just the three of them. It doesn't even include any of the other stuff.
And again, there's other stories that do work like that now. Like obviously the A Song of Ice and Fire books. George R. R. Martin was very inspired by Lord of the Rings, and it shows because he does a lot of that as well.
Yeah, he never even had a fellowship. The closest thing he had
Yeah,
to a fellowship was the Starks.
a book I just finished reading, Age of Iron, on the other hand, it does something a little bit like that, which is all of the different like party members start separate and they come together. And then there's a little bit of drama and stupidity toward the end where they all sort of split up and then they come back together again. And then it looks like they're all going off again for the next book. But it's not, it didn't feel the same, you know? But I look at these things and I'm like, I feel like it comes down to two main things why, despite being so archetypical in so many ways, the structure and the way it's told, The Lord of the Rings, is different compared to a lot of these other things. And it comes down to me as into focus and themes as the main reasons. Focus is easy, I think. The smaller and more tight knit your cast of characters, the less you're gonna have reason to branch off into a million different side narratives. And for faster paced storytelling, because modern stories do tend to be much more quick paced compared to older stories, because attention spans and all that, and expectations and all that. With a smaller cast, with a faster pace, there's not room to do all these different spin offs and side quests and tangents. It's a lot more of a direct focus narrative, and that's fine. That's not a problem. That neither method is right or wrong. It's just a trend I've noticed.
Yeah, it is. There's a lot of people doing a lot more hand waving and a lot. Yeah, there's more going on here, but we're looking over here.
And that's like that's not again, that's not a bad thing, and it opens you up to some interesting things. You get a lot more time to focus on character dynamics within a group.
Yeah. No, I mean like, well, we've talked about Aragon and inheritance a lot, and that's one of my favorite examples of that. Like, despite being a very big sprawling world we're taught about, the POV rarely ever leaves Aragon, and when it does, it's not for long.
Yeah, I mean, the later books do it more.
Yeah, I mean, Eldest is specifically, we get a decent amount of splitting to Roran, and I love Roran's story. It might be, weirdly enough, my favorite part of that book, despite the lack of
No,
dragons.
no, I'm with you. But yeah, even then, like it is a smaller cast, and it's more like two small casts working in tandem throughout the book, as opposed to say what A Song of Ice and Fire does, where it's a million different individuals and groups spread across this massive setting, and what Tolkien did, which was have a lot of smaller subgroups all split off and go their own way and do their own thing. That was all essential to the ultimate goal, but also very self-contained.
Yeah.
And that's just the difference between, a broader focus and a more narrow focus. That's fine. I also think a lot of the differences for like why actual growth in ability and power, not just knowledge and experience, factors in is important as well because the thematics of a lot of fantasy stories modern fantasy stories, they don't tend to be about the same things as what Lord of the Rings is about. Yeah, they both have their big bad with their massive army and all that, but in most modern fantasy stories, they are stories about overcoming an oppressive force. They are about rebellion against an oppressor. And ultimately, to defeat an oppressor, you have to outmaneuver and overpower them in some way. It's not the only aspect of those stories, and it's not the only aspect of how you come out on top, but in some way, you need to prove more formidable than your adversary.
Yeah. Because the adversaries always, partially for the sake of scale, but in stories like this, they are grand and powerful and sometimes kind of all-encompassing because otherwise you would have to ask how they became a threat in the first place.
Yeah. And those stories are about the little guy rising up and becoming a force that can compete with that effectively. That's not what The Lord of the Rings is about. Yes, it is a little guy, quite literally, who is opposed by this grand, massive, malevolent force. But The Lord of the Rings isn't about overcoming power, it's about how power corrupts. It is all about the way that this enticing dark power breaks you down and makes you worse and makes you less of a person than you were.
Yeah, it's kind of like the whole power corrupts absolutely thing,
That's
but I would say
exactly what it is.
I was just going to say, I would almost say Lord of the Rings takes it even more seriously than that phrase actually implies, because it's easy for people to take power corrupts absolutely and be like, oh, okay, well, I mean, as long as one person's not too powerful, that's okay, right? And Lord of the Rings says, no, any power corrupts. It's just a matter of how much.
Fair.
Like every example we see of anybody who ever was or became powerful, they in some way either become worse or only escape from it by being diminished and losing that power, usually in a cataclysmic fashion that leaves them much worse off, despite being free of that corruption.
Yeah, it's a story about not not just how power corrupts and breaks you and morphs you into something malevolent, but it is also a story about how seductive that power can be and how you have to resist it if you want to remain a moral being.
And that's why he chose hobbits.
That's why he chose hobbits, but it's also why the heroes, by and large, in the Lord of the Rings could not become powerful because it would completely shit on the moral and message that Tolkien was writing about. The whole thing with Sauron is that he is incredibly powerful. He is overwhelmingly powerful. You are never going to beat that by trying to match power with power. You are only going
So
to be
there's no point.
you're only going to be seduced by it and eventually cave into that thing and become exactly what you're seeking to destroy in the first place.
Yeah, he's literally a timeless being, essentially a god who just so happens he's what happens if you take a god and then even make a god have a human's ambition to more power. And that means for all intents and purposes, he is power. He's so far beyond anything anyone else could ever be as far as power goes that seeking power will not only ultimately seduce you and lead to your corruption, it will ultimately lead to him because he might as well be the god of power, the patron saint of power.
Yeah, if you give in and seek the power, you only make him more powerful and make the bad stuff worse.
That's why the one member of the crew, the one member of the fellowship even, who wanted power and just thought about grabbing it. He didn't even really try that hard. He thought about grabbing power for all of 30 seconds, and that killed him. That was all it took. Boromir died because he gave in to the desire for power barely for all of 30 seconds. Like, sometimes people look back in the story and they hate on Boromir for that decision, and I'm like, yes, it was obviously the wrong decision, but he didn't even give in that thoroughly. He like he was almost willing to make a grab for Frodo and be like, "Give me that ring." And then Frodo ran away, and then he thought about it for a few seconds and went, you know what? I was wrong. I shouldn't have done that. I'm gonna go apologize." And it was too late.
Boromir is actually probably my favorite character in the Lord of the Rings because
I love
because
Boromir.
yeah, specifically because he faltered and then gave everything to try and make up for it. That's a compelling character to me. I love a flawed character like that who is trying to make up for their failings.
And it's kind of funny. Boromir, I think, was closer to being the true heir of Isildur. Why can't I say the I part of that
Isildur?
right now? I think it's like Isildur. Yeah,
Yeah.
there we go. That's a little better. But anyways, I feel like Boromir is kind of more his heir than Aragorn is because he did a microcosm of like almost kind of the same thing Isildur did. It just happened a lot faster.
It was important like it was genuinely very important though that he showed that there is a point where you can still come back.
Yeah, it's you can you can trip, you can falter, you can stumble, and as long as you don't fully give in, you don't give up, you can come back. You can do better and be better, but there are consequences to your actions.
Yes. And see, I love that. It's interesting because I think a lot of people who aren't like deep into fantasy or big readers or even or whatever, I feel like a lot of people envisage the Lord of the Rings and think of it as supremely optimistic and whimsical, almost.
It's not.
It's not. It is actually a fairly tonally and thematically complicated story, especially tonally here, because the big theme is pretty simple. It is all about like how power seduces and corrupts. Um, but Tolkien was not subtle about that. But the tone is where things do get a little bit more grey and interesting because yeah, it is ultimately an optimistic story about how the the little moral guy can win by being the little moral guy, by not giving in and succumbing to that darkness. It is optimistic in saying, yeah, you may falter and do wrong, but you can still come back from that and be a hero in the end. Like, but it's also very clearly saying doing the right thing is hard. It is not easy. It frequently sucks. It may take a deep toll on you. Power is easy. Corruption is easy. And you have to take the hard road to create a world that's worth living in.
You have to take it because it's true and you believe in it, because even doing the right thing won't erase your mistakes and it won't erase the consequences of other people's mistakes, other people's corruption and power. All it does is fight against it, and it makes things better. It doesn't fix everything.
Yeah. Hence, Boromir never gets a chance to make up with Frodo. He dies like a hero, but he dies before he has a chance to apologize and try
He
and set
dies
things right.
he dies never seeing him again, with that image of him as a fearful threat still existing to Frodo, and Frodo himself Frodo doesn't get rewarded for all this journey and Frodo doing the right thing. We already talked about how he's diminished when he gets back, but I didn't talk more about like one of the only other things that it's a real shame is missing from the movies, but it would have been nice if we had like a short film or something that came afterwards for it. There's the scouring of the Shire. Like there's a whole chunk of the story about the hobbits coming back and industry and evil has tried to make its way to the Shire while they were gone, while they were not protecting it, while they were not a part of that world and their home. It started to fall apart and they come out and they work on it and everything's better. But even in the movies, they're sitting there in the Shire, the perfect idyllic little nice rural foresty area where there are no problems and everything is so nice that everybody has second breakfast and lives to be 11D12 and all that. And he doesn't, he literally can't even live in that world. He can't live in a world that's that idyllic anymore. He's sitting there depressed. He's writing his book and doing his best only for, to sit and talk to Sam at some point and more or less just be like, I don't I don't work here anymore. This isn't what I am anymore. I have to leave.
Yeah, he is so beaten down and broken by everything he has seen that being in a utopia almost weighs heavy because it's a constant reminder of all the shit.
Yeah. And also just because he's not utopian anymore. He's not
Yeah,
idyllic anymore. He's not peaceful and serene and happy anymore.
no. But that's the thing, like, yeah, he paid a toll and it sucked, but because he did that, that idyllic borderline utopia gets to be rebuilt and exist again. The, nations of man get to come together and thrive again. It's kind of a tough pill to swallow, but this is the end result of a series of missteps and people choosing the easy path and giving in to temptation that got to that point that made it that much more grueling for the people for the people who were choosing the right path. And it makes a lot of sense that these are the themes and tonal choices that Tolkien would choose to lean into because he lived through a world war. He was a soldier.
He made that sacrifice. Whatever you may think of the war itself, like he he made the same sacrifice that the heroes in his story have to make. He fought, he went through all that, and it did not make him feel better. It did not make him happier in the end, but he was trying to do a good thing and make the world better in the only way he felt like he could.
And, that's a message that is sadly pretty timeless. The world hasn't gotten easier. There is mostly people in positions of privilege and power continue to make missteps that make things harder for everyone else, that make us have to fight that much harder to create a better world for whoever comes next. But
Yeah.
what's the choice? Like the correct choice is obvious. You still fight, you still try to do the right thing, even though it has gotten hard, even though it may yet get harder, because the alternative is giving in and allowing the world to become a shallow husk of what it once was.
Yeah, and that's always feel what it feels like it mostly comes down to is just the fact that like it's not hard to see what the right thing is. It's hard to do it.
But ultimately, like for the big picture, for the vast sprawling world that those characters inhabit and also that we inhabit in reality, yeah, the hard choice is what you is the right one. It's what is ultimately better for everyone in the long term.
And the more people make the right choice, too, the easier it is on everybody who does, and the better things turn out.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's why everything is so diminished in the book because people, person after person after person after person, who was in a position to make those choices, kept making the wrong ones. So like that's a lot of like tonal and thematic complexity and layering, and I think that sometimes because the world is so vast and we have so much respect for the world building, almost we forget to give credence to the themes and the like masterful playing with tone that Tolkien did, you know, because that shit is incredibly important and is one of the primary, most obvious in some ways and most impactful ways in others. It's one of the major examples of what we were talking about in our first episode, where fantasy is frequently a very elaborate metaphor.
Yeah, it always ties back to reality in key important ways.
And for Lord of the Rings, that was about power, uh, and morality and the choices we make in regards to those things. In a lot of modern stories, we tend to focus more on the actual conflict. And that's not a bad thing either. It's just that we are talking more about the idea of rise up against tyranny as opposed to the personal burden of resisting easy power. And yeah, I know. I guess it's really interesting to me that so many stories latched on to little guys fight bigger power and not onto elves and dwarves and not onto that. And that's not again, that's not a criticism. I write a lot of stories about rising up against tyranny and class divides and shit like that. That's not a criticism. It's just genuinely a point of interest. And I wonder, why it is that way. I don't have an answer. I just think it's interesting.
Yeah, and it is. I absolutely feel the same way.
It's crazy to me that like we can look back at it and there's this massive world, all of these characters going on their own personal journeys with their own narrative arcs in this world. All of it linking back to these core themes. It's no wonder that Tolkien's world and his stories had the impact they did, especially considering, in a post-World War era when he published them, and based on all the history we had to lean on when we read it, and also just how impressive it was. And Jesus Christ, I'm not at a loss for words often, but uh, almost ironically, the sheer scale and how impressed I am by what Tolkien did makes it hard to talk about.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly it makes it hard to talk about succinctly. There are people who have written many, many essays and entire courses on just the languages he created, or let alone all the rest of the story. I don't think we could begin to do it justice just in this 1 hour pseudo-analytical discussion.
No, not no way. It would take forever. Many people already have devoted so much time to it.
And I mean, that in and of itself is a testament to the quality and the scale of what was achieved here. Now, to bring it back down, like, again, I don't think there's ever going to be another Lord of the Rings.
No,
And that's not a statement out of negativity. That's not saying, oh, we don't write like that anymore or whatever. I mean, we don't, but not in a negative way. We just have different focuses and things like that. It's more a matter of the timing, the vacancy in fantasy almost, because it was by no means the established genre it is now. The person who wrote it with the experiences and skill set he had, the sheer scale of it. There's definitely going to be things that imitate it. There's definitely going to be things that are inspired by it. But I think it's genuinely, despite having so many things derived from it, one of a kind in everything it achieved and how it achieved it. Where it's probably a sort of it. I mean, it is a cornerstone, I guess, in storytelling history. It's one of those
Yeah.
rare. It's one of those rare things that will be often imitated, always a source of imitation, but never again will there be another one of that. And I mean, technically, that's true for any story, really. But a lot of stories, you can kind of you could swap some characters and plot beats around, and you wouldn't notice.
Yeah.
This is not that.
Easily.
And I think it's important to give it its due. I do think it's a shame as well that, some of those lesser known contemporaries, or if not lesser known, less regarded hippos, don't necessarily have the same impact or get the same credit. That's not to say that they deserve it like more than Tolkien. By and large, they don't. But it is sometimes a shame to look at other things and go, I mean, there were other people who wrote fantasy at the time, but you know, we don't know any of their names.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. It hasn't been the same thing.
And that's kind of and it's so strange that he created something so good and so monolithic that a lot of people are still are still creating in its shadow. So I guess just to bring us back around to that earlier point, The Lord of the Rings is a masterpiece, and trying to recapture it and remake it again to create, not necessarily like retell the story, but to do that again, it is it is borderline a miracle that Peter Jackson kind of did it.
Yeah. It
Like
it was thought to be unadaptable before.
the fact that it shouldn't have been possible and someone did it, achieved it. The fact that we have basically had the Lord of the Rings twice now, it's not gonna happen again. I think it's deeply important that we appreciate it and very much okay to be inspired by it, but there is no point in trying to write the next Lord of the Rings.
No. No, try to make your own thing. I and ultimately that's all you can do. You can't that some things can't be recreated. I don't like even though it's not quite the same thing. I wouldn't say somebody could I wouldn't say ooh my gosh, excuse me. I wouldn't even say a Song of Ice and Fire can happen again, which is why George better get off his ass and finish those books.
I mean, that's the closest. Like that's the thing. That's the closest example, I think. Like I think that other than the adaptation, which is not quite the same thing. That's not really what I'm talking about. A Song of Ice and Fire is probably the closest anyone has gotten to recapturing the sheer scale, sprawling, epic world with all these complicated themes. The closest to capturing that lightning in a bottle that the Lord of the Rings
Yeah.
was. I think A Song of Ice and Fire is the closest. And as we have established, even that, when we're talking about scale, does not compare.
No. That world is not as big or as sprawling as Middle Earth, but it has a
It's
lot going on.
Yeah, I mean it's arguably more complicated. If I not even argue, I think it is just more complicated because it is a world that is deeply steeped in politics
Yeah.
and the stories in it are deeply steeped in politics. But I think it's a really good example actually of very clearly, deeply, strongly inspired by, but still doing its own thing.
Yeah. It it definitely is.
But yeah, I mean, shit, man. Like, if we wanted to really get in depth and thoroughly break down like every major plot beat, every movie, every book, every character's personal journey, we do not have the time. Like, I know we've said many times, like I've joked several times about how these episodes, if we really got into depth on certain things, would take like 4 to 8 hours instead of 1 to maybe 2 at a stretch. If we really got into the depths of Lord of the Rings stuff, we would just have to make this like a 6-part miniseries.
Yeah, genuinely.
So I think we can leave it on that note of often imitated, never truly repeated, but that's okay.
Yeah, it doesn't need to be.
So, if you have enjoyed listening to us rant about how incredible Tolkien is, and maybe have forgiven me for any of my previous critiques over his prose, you can find more of these episodes if you're listening to it on Spotify, YouTube, whatever, on my website, radfordwrites.com, where I also post the stories I write that are nowhere near as sprawling as Tolkien, but sometimes fantasy and sometimes even a little bit inspired by his work. Over there, I also post blogs and articles, and my other podcast, Fixation, goes up there. If I do it, you can find it on that website. And if you would like to hear more from John, you can hear him streaming over on YouTube and Twitch as Sephir, Sephear, or collaborating more with me in the future.
Yeah, and I like Lord of the Rings.
Me too. I promise. Really, I do.
He does. He likes it, guys. He's not. Listen, you would never even get to stab him with the pitchforks and torches. If he was a bad enough hater, I would be stabbing him first, and I could get to him faster than you.
And I don't have a fancy ring that makes me invisible to everyone except that big eye over there.